Sign it, Mom. You won't need your savings where you're going, my daughter-in-law said with a smile that never reached her eyes. My son didn't argue. He didn't even look at me. The folder slid across the table, stopping just inches from my hands, as though my entire life had been reduced to a stack of papers waiting for a signature. I reached for the pen. Olivia relaxed. Ryan finally exhaled. Neither of them noticed the tiny detail that would change everything before the afternoon was over. They believed they already knew how this story ended. They believed an old woman sitting quietly across the table had finally accepted defeat. They never questioned why I looked so calm. They never asked why I smiled before uncapping the pen. And they certainly never imagined that the document I was about to sign was not the one they had spent months preparing. 48 hours earlier, I had been thinking about nothing more dramatic than organizing old family recipes and deciding which flowers to plant beside my front porch before spring fully settled over our little neighborhood outside Portland. At 68, retirement had taught me to appreciate ordinary mornings, the soft whistle of my kettle, the warmth of sunlight across the kitchen floor, and the comfort of knowing every dollar my late husband and I had saved came from decades of honest work. Every paycheck, every canceled vacation, every extra shift, every careful decision had quietly become the savings account Olivia now called unused money. Until that week, I honestly believed she admired the discipline that had allowed Robert and me to build a secure future. I was about to learn that admiration and entitlement can sometimes wear exactly the same face. The next morning, I drove to the same community bank where Robert and I had opened our first savings account more than 30 years earlier. The building had been renovated twice since then, but the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh coffee still greeted me the moment I stepped inside. I had no appointment. I only wanted to ask one simple question that had refused to leave my mind since Olivia first mentioned my savings during Sunday dinner. The young teller welcomed me with a warm smile before quietly asking me to wait for the branch manager. That alone felt unusual. When Daniel Harper invited me into his office, his expression carried the careful kindness people use when they know more than they should. He folded his hands on the desk and asked whether I had recently authorized anyone to discuss my accounts. I answered no without hesitation. He nodded slowly, then explained that someone had visited the bank twice during the previous week, asking detailed questions about my financial records. They had not been given any information because they were not listed on my accounts, but they seemed remarkably confident they soon would be. I thanked him for protecting my privacy, although a cold weight settled quietly in my chest. As I walked back to my car beneath the gray Oregon sky, I realized something that disturbed me far more than the question itself. This had not been an impulsive conversation at the dinner table. Someone had already been planning the future they expected me to surrender. I did not call Ryan on the drive home. I did not confront Olivia. I had spent enough years raising a family to understand that people often revealed far more when they believed no one suspected them. Instead, I unlocked the front door, placed my purse on the kitchen counter, and stood quietly beside the window where Robert used to drink his morning coffee. Suddenly, a memory returned with remarkable clarity. About 6 months earlier, Olivia had casually asked where I kept my financial records in case of an emergency. At the time, I thought she was simply being considerate. A few weeks later, she wondered whether my savings account had a beneficiary. Then she suggested that managing paperwork must be exhausting for someone my age. Each conversation had sounded harmless by itself. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Before sunset, I called Margaret Ellis, the attorney who had handled Robert's estate. She listened without interrupting, allowing every detail to settle before speaking in her calm, measured voice. She did not accuse anyone. She did not offer dramatic advice. She simply asked one question that stayed with me long after our conversation ended. "Helen, has anyone recently become unusually interested in your finances?" I closed my eyes for a moment before answering. "Yes," I whispered. And I believe they expected me to notice much later than I actually did. After my conversation with Margaret, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed where Robert had always kept the papers that mattered most. The envelopes were arranged exactly as he had left them, each one labeled in his careful handwriting. Looking through them felt less like searching for documents and more like listening to his quiet voice again. Robert believed that money was never the true inheritance. Character was. He used to tell Ryan that every dollar in our savings represented a choice we had made together. Another weekend spent working instead of traveling, another old car repaired instead of replaced, another dream postponed so our family could have security. Ryan had nodded every time his father spoke those words. He had even thanked us for the sacrifices we made. That was why the recent changes hurt more than I wanted to admit. My son no longer asked how I was sleeping or whether I needed anything around the house. Instead, every conversation somehow drifted toward retirement expenses or simplifying my life. I wondered whether those questions had been his own, or whether someone else had carefully planted them over time. As I closed the final folder, one handwritten note slipped onto the floor. It contained only a single sentence from Robert. Never let kindness become permission for someone else to make your choices. The following morning, Margaret and I met in her office overlooking the Willamette River. She had already reviewed every document I brought from home, comparing them with the copies she had kept in her secure files for years. When she finally looked up, her expression remained calm, which somehow made her next words even more reassuring. Everything I owned was still exactly where Robert and I intended it to be. No signatures had been forged. No legal changes had been made. Whoever believed my savings would soon become available had been counting on one thing alone: my willingness to trust without asking questions. Margaret suggested we make several updates, not because anything was wrong, but because preparation was always stronger than reaction. We reviewed every account, confirmed every beneficiary, and created additional safeguards that required my direct approval before any future changes could take effect. Before I left, she reminded me not to change my daily routine. If someone expects you to become suspicious, she said gently, your calm will tell them nothing. Driving home, I realized I did not need to pretend to be fearless. I only needed to remain patient. That afternoon, Olivia called to ask whether I had thought more about simplifying my finances. I smiled before answering in the warmest voice I could manage. I have, I said. In fact, I have already started making plans. For the next 2 days, I gave Olivia exactly what she expected to see. I answered her calls with cheerful patience. I thanked her whenever she offered to help organize my paperwork. I even mentioned that managing financial records had become more tiring than it used to be. Each small comment seemed to encourage her confidence. Ryan also sounded lighter whenever we spoke, as though a burden had already been lifted from his shoulders. Neither of them realized that every important decision had already been secured with Margaret's guidance. My accounts required additional verification. My estate documents had been carefully updated. Every safeguard had been reviewed twice. There was nothing dramatic about the process. It was simply the quiet work of protecting a lifetime of responsibility. On Thursday evening, Olivia invited me to dinner for Saturday, explaining that it would be easier if everyone discussed my future together. I accepted without hesitation. Her excitement slipped through the phone despite her effort to sound casual. After we ended the call, Margaret telephoned with one final update. Everything was complete. There was nothing left to prepare except my own peace of mind. I stood on my back porch watching the last light disappear behind the tall evergreen trees, and for the first time all week, I felt no fear. Sometimes the strongest position is not the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it is simply the person who already knows the truth before anyone else does. Saturday arrived with the kind of quiet sunshine that usually made family gatherings feel effortless. I carried a homemade apple pie to Ryan and Olivia's house, just as I had done dozens of times before, and Olivia greeted me with unusual enthusiasm. She insisted on taking my coat, poured me a fresh cup of coffee, and kept assuring me that everyone only wanted what was best for me. Ryan smiled often, but there was a nervousness behind his eyes that he could not completely hide. Throughout lunch, the conversation wandered from vacations to home improvements before gently settling on retirement planning. It felt rehearsed, as though every topic had been carefully arranged to lead us toward a single destination. Finally, Olivia stood, disappeared into the dining room, and returned carrying the familiar folder. She placed it carefully in front of me before sliding a polished silver pen across the table. The room became noticeably quieter. Ryan folded his hands without saying a word. Olivia leaned forward with a reassuring smile and explained that these documents would make life simpler for everyone and remove unnecessary stress from my future. I looked down at the papers without reaching for them immediately. Then I lifted my eyes, smiled just as warmly as she had smiled at me all afternoon, and slowly picked up the pen, already knowing that the next few minutes would unfold very differently from the future they had imagined. With steady hands, I opened the folder and slowly turned each page, as though I were reading every word for the very first time. Olivia watched me with quiet anticipation, while Ryan remained unusually silent, avoiding my eyes. When I reached the signature page, I uncapped the pen and carefully signed my name. Olivia smiled almost immediately, convinced everything had gone exactly as planned. Then I closed the folder without sliding it back across the table. Instead, I reached into my handbag and removed a sealed envelope with Margaret's law firm's name printed neatly across the front. "Before we finish," I said gently, "there is one document everyone should read." Ryan frowned as I handed him the envelope. Inside was a letter explaining that every important financial account had already been placed under updated legal protections several days earlier. Any future changes required my direct approval under procedures that had already been verified with the bank and my attorney. Margaret had also prepared new estate documents reflecting my current wishes. Olivia's confident expression slowly faded as she realized the papers in front of me no longer carried the importance she had expected. No argument followed. No raised voices filled the room. Only a long, unmistakable silence settled over the table, as the truth became impossible for anyone to ignore. No one spoke for several moments after Ryan finished reading Margaret's letter. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have been. Olivia carefully placed the documents back on the table, no longer looking at them with certainty but with quiet disbelief. Ryan finally looked at me, and for the first time in weeks I saw something familiar in his eyes. It was not confidence. It was reflection. I stood, thanked them for lunch, and picked up the apple pie that had never been served. As I reached the front door, Ryan softly called my name and asked whether everything could still be repaired. I turned toward him with the same calm that had carried me through the entire week. I told him that trust was much like the savings Robert and I had spent decades building. It grew slowly through patience, honesty, and sacrifice, but it could disappear much faster than anyone expected. Rebuilding it would take time, and it would require actions instead of promises. A few months later, my life looked remarkably different. I volunteered at the local library, joined a travel group for retired teachers, and spent peaceful mornings tending the flower beds Robert and I had planned together years before. My savings had protected my future, but protecting my self-respect proved to be the greater blessing. That was the lesson I wished I had learned much earlier, because the greatest security in life is never the balance in a bank account. It is knowing that no one else gets to decide your worth.